June 18, 1944. 30,000 feet above the Philippine Sea. The air at this altitude was thin enough to kill, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Inside the cockpit of his F-6F Hellcat, Lieutenant Commander Edward Owen watched the sun set over an ocean that stretched to infinity in every direction. Below him, invisible in the gathering darkness, sailed 15 aircraft carriers, the largest concentration of naval air power ever assembled by human hands. Tomorrow, they would meet the Imperial Japanese Navy in what would become the greatest carrier battle in history. What none of them knew, not the admirals studying charts in dimly lit ready rooms, not the young pilots writing final letters home, not the Japanese commanders steaming toward this rendezvous with destiny, was that tomorrow would witness not a battle, but an execution. The USS Enterprise cut through dark water with the purposeful silence of a predator. Men called her the Big E. Others called her the Grey Ghost. The Japanese had announced her sinking so many times that Tokyo Rose had run out of creative ways to describe her destruction. Yet, here she sailed, bearing scars from Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz. Every rivet told a story, every plate of armor remembered fire. Her crew of 2,000 men moved through passages lit by red battle lights, their faces cast in shadows that made them look older than their years. Most were barely 20. Some had been fighting since the war began. Others would see their first combat when the sun rose. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher stood on the bridge of his flagship, studying reports that told an incomplete story. Submarines had made contact with the Japanese fleet. 9 carriers, 5 battleships, escorts beyond counting. They were coming. The question was not if they would fight, but when and under what terms. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the 5th Fleet, had made a decision that would be debated for decades. Rather than race westward to catch the enemy at maximum range, he would hold position near Saipan. Protect the invasion beaches, force the Japanese to come to him. It was the decision of a man who remembered Midway, where aggressive Japanese pursuit had led to disaster. History would judge whether he was wise or timid. Tomorrow would provide the answer written in fire and blood. 300 miles to the west, aboard the carrier Zuikaku, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa prepared his own gamble. Operation Eigo, the decisive battle that would destroy American carrier power and save the Empire. His plan relied on advantages that existed more in hope than reality. Japanese aircraft had slightly longer range, he told himself. They could strike first. His carriers could launch from beyond American reach, devastate the enemy, recover aircraft, strike again. Mathematics written in fuel calculations and operational radius. What he did not know, what Japanese intelligence had failed to grasp, was that the Americans had rewritten the rules of carrier warfare. Radar that could see 100 miles, fighter direction that could position interceptors with surgical precision, aircraft that could absorb punishment and still fly home. Pilots trained to standards that Japanese replacement programs could no longer match. The mathematics of war had shifted beneath his feet, and tomorrow he would discover that all his careful calculations had been rendered meaningless by an enemy that fought with industrial logic rather than warrior spirit. The transformation had begun years earlier, in factories that stretched across a continent. Republic Aviation, Grumman Aerospace, Consolidated Aircraft. Names that meant nothing to Japanese strategists became the architects of their destruction. While Zero fighters were still being assembled by hand in workshops that resembled craft studios, American factories produced Hellcats. With the mechanical precision of automobile assembly lines, 1 aircraft every hour, engines manufactured in separate facilities, shipped thousands of miles, installed with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. It was industrial warfare perfected, mass production weaponized. The F-6F Hellcat represented everything Japanese designers had sacrificed in pursuit of range and agility. It was heavy, nearly 10,000 pounds empty, more than a Zero fully loaded. It was slow in a turn, it climbed like it was hauling cargo, but it was built with American philosophy. Overwhelming power, survivability, firepower. 650 caliber machine guns, each one capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Combined rate of fire, 4,800 rounds per minute. enough concentrated firepower to saw a fighter in half, detonate a bomber, shred a torpedo plane before its pilot could even register the threat. The ammunition itself was a revelation. Armour-piercing incendiary rounds that burned at 3,000 degrees, enough to ignite aluminum, fuel, human flesh, each round a small piece of industrial fury. But the real weapon was not the aircraft, it was the system. American pilot training programs had evolved into precision instruments for creating killers, 300 to 400 flight hours before entering combat, gunnery training against towed targets, tactics refined through analysis of gun camera footage from every previous engagement, fighter direction courses that taught coordination between radar operators and airborne pilots. The Americans had industrialized warfare itself, turning combat into a repeatable process that could be taught, measured, improved. Japanese pilots, by contrast, were being rushed to the fleet with less than 100 hours total flight time. Some had never fired their guns at a moving target. Others had barely mastered carrier landings. They were brave. They were determined. They were already dead. Enterprise herself embodied this transformation. Her Combat Information Center, a darkened room filled with radar repeaters and plotting tables, represented technology that most Japanese carriers lacked entirely. Her crew had trained together for months, each man knowing his role in the larger machine. Her aircraft maintenance crews could turn around a fighter in 15 minutes. Rearm, refuel, inspect for damage, push it back to the catapult. The carrier operated with the efficiency of a factory floor, each action choreographed, each movement purposeful. In the ready rooms, pilots studied recognition silhouettes, memorized tactics, prepared themselves for what was coming. Some wrote letters they hoped would never be mailed. Others simply sat in silence, smoking cigarettes, watching the clock count down to dawn. The waiting was always worse than the fighting. Dawn broke clear and deadly. At 05, radar operators aboard Enterprise detected the first contact. 70 miles out, single aircraft, probably a scout. The information passed through the Combat Information Center, up to flag plot, across to the other carriers. By 1000, the radar screens were alive with contacts that looked like clouds of metal insects. Raid 1, 69 aircraft, bearing west, altitude unknown, course steady, closing. The voice of the fighter director was calm, professional. All fighters, this is Blue Base, Vector 265, Angels 20, many bandits. Angels 20, 20,000 feet, many bandits. The euphemism could not disguise what was coming. Lieutenant Commander Owen led his squadron off Enterprise's deck, the Hellcat's massive engine roaring as the catapult hurled him into blue sky. Within minutes, dozens of fighters from across Task Force 58 were climbing, forming up, positioning themselves between the approaching enemy and their carriers. The coordination was beautiful in its precision. Each squadron knew its altitude, its position, its role. Fighter directors watched radar screens and spoke vectors that guided aircraft they could not see toward enemies they could not touch. It was warfare conducted through electronic intermediaries, human skill channeled through machines. The Japanese approached in formation, tight, disciplined, exactly as their training manuals prescribed. They flew as if it was still 1942, when such tactics had swept across the Pacific, when American pilots had died in burning aircraft because they tried to dogfight Zeros. But this was not 1942. The Americans had learned. More importantly, they had adapted. Owen positioned his division above and behind the approaching formation, giving his Hellcats the energy advantage. Speed was life. Altitude was speed. The physics of combat reduced to simple equations that Japanese pilots either did not understand or could not execute. At 10:36, the killing began. The Hellcats dove through the Japanese formation like hammers through paper. The sound of 650 caliber guns firing in unison was a mechanical scream, a noise that carried for miles across empty sky. Japanese aircraft began falling immediately. Some exploded outright, their fuel tanks igniting in fireballs visible from the carriers below. Others shed pieces, wings separating, tails ripping away, pilots ejecting into empty air 30 miles from the nearest land. The gun cameras recorded everything. Frame after frame of aircraft disintegrating under concentrated fire. The mechanical eye saw no mercy, recorded no hesitation, just cause and effect. Trigger squeeze, convergence, destruction. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, temporarily assigned to Enterprise's task group, would later describe the engagement in words that captured its one-sided nature. "I picked the leader and fired. He exploded, picked the next one. Same thing. They didn't break formation, didn't take evasive action." In 8 minutes, Vrasiu shot down 6 aircraft, bringing his total to 19 kills. The 6th victory came so easily that he later admitted feeling embarrassed. This was not combat, this was slaughter. The Japanese pilots, some with less than 50 hours in type, were facing men who had survived 2 years of brutal warfare, flying aircraft specifically designed to kill them. The outcome had been determined before the first trigger was pulled. They kept coming, wave after wave. At 1100, Raid 2, 109 aircraft. At 1300, Raid 3, 47 aircraft. At 1400, Raid 4, 82 aircraft. Each formation was detected at 70 miles. Each was intercepted by fighters directed with radar precision. Each was destroyed before reaching the task force. The Americans had created a killing zone in the sky, a sphere of death, through which no Japanese aircraft could pass. Those that survived the fighters faced curtains of anti-aircraft fire from the screening destroyers and cruisers, 40mm guns, 20mm guns, 5-inch guns throwing up shells that exploded in black puffs. The sky became a garden of death, blooming with fire. Aboard Enterprise, the cycle repeated endlessly. Fighters landed. Deck crews swarmed over them, inspecting for damage, refueling from hoses that smelled of high-octane gasoline, reloading ammunition belts that weighed nearly as much as a man. Pilots climbed from cockpits, faces marked with the imprint of oxygen masks, hands still shaking from adrenaline. They debriefed in rapid bursts, sketching positions with their hands, estimating kills, then climbing back into aircraft still warm from the previous mission. The carrier operated at peak efficiency, every man performing his role in the larger machine. There was no glory in it, only work. Brutal, endless work that happened to involve killing enemy pilots by the dozen. The Japanese pilots, those few who survived the initial interceptions, pressed their attacks with desperate courage. They knew they were dying. Radio intercepts captured their final transmissions. "I am hit. Engine on fire. Tell my family." Some tried to ram American ships, their aircraft too damaged to pull out of dives. Others simply flew until their fuel ran out and the engine coughed into silence and the aircraft fell like a wounded bird into an ocean that swallowed everything. The water was littered with debris, oil slicks, floating wreckage, bodies that would never be recovered. The Philippine Sea was becoming a graveyard and the killing had barely begun. By sunset, the mathematics were undeniable. 373 Japanese aircraft launched, 243 destroyed in aerial combat, another 30 lost to operational accidents or fuel exhaustion, an additional 50 land-based aircraft shot down over Guam. Total Japanese losses: 315 carrier aircraft, 50 land-based aircraft. American losses from all 15 carriers: 23 aircraft in air combat, 27 aircrew. Kill ratio better than 13-1. But numbers could not capture the psychological destruction. The Japanese Naval Air Arm, the force that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had swept across the Pacific in 1942, had been gutted in a single day. Admiral Ozawa, receiving fragmentary reports aboard Zuikaku, believed his pilots had inflicted devastating losses on the American carriers. He was planning his next strike when the truth finally reached him. His air. Groups were gone, destroyed, annihilated, and the Americans were coming for him. Night fell on Task Force 58 like a curtain closing on the first act of a tragedy. In the ready rooms of Enterprise, pilots sat in silence that was louder than words. Some stared at nothing. Others smoked cigarettes down to their fingers. The day's killing had been so easy that it felt wrong. Combat was supposed to be a contest between equals. This had been execution. Lieutenant Junior grade pilots who had been nervous that morning were now aces, having shot down 5 aircraft before lunch. They did not celebrate. They simply sat, processing what they had witnessed, what they had done. In sleeping compartments throughout the ship, men lay in their bunks and tried to sleep. The air conditioning hummed. The ventilation fans whispered, but sleep would not come for many. They replayed the day in their minds. The enemy aircraft falling, the pilots who had ejected, floating in the water, watching their attackers circle overhead before flying away. War had become industrial, systematic. The Americans had turned killing into a process that could be measured, optimized, repeated. There was efficiency in it. There was horror in it too. Captain Matthias Gardner stood on the bridge, studying the darkness. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the Japanese fleet was retreating. Ozawa still had carriers, still had battleships, but his air groups were destroyed, and a carrier without aircraft was just a fast-moving target. The question was whether they could find him before he escaped. Spruance had been cautious on the 19th, holding position, protecting Saipan. Tomorrow would require aggression. Tomorrow they would have to launch at maximum range, risk fuel exhaustion, risk night landings. Tomorrow would test whether American carriers could project power as effectively as they could defend themselves. In the Combat Information Center, intelligence officers compiled reports that would reshape naval doctrine for decades. The effectiveness of radar-directed fighter interception had exceeded all projections. The F-6F Hellcat had proven itself the finest carrier fighter in the world. The coordination between carriers, between fighters and fighter directors, between offense and defense, had functioned with mechanical precision. But beneath the professional analysis was a darker realization. Modern warfare had become so one-sided that it no longer resembled combat. It resembled industrial processing. Raw materials in one end, dead pilots out the other. The Americans had not just won a battle. They had demonstrated a new form of warfare where technological superiority could render courage meaningless. Dawn brought no contact. Scout planes launched in the pre-dawn darkness, fanning out in a search pattern that covered thousands of square miles. Hours passed. The tension built with each minute. If the Japanese escaped, if Ozawa's carriers survived to rebuild their air groups, the war could be prolonged by months. Every man in Task Force 58 understood the stakes. Find them, destroy them, end this. At 1540, an Enterprise scout plane radioed contact. Multiple carriers, battleships, escorts, bearing 330 degrees, distance 275 miles. The range was at the absolute limit of American aircraft capability. Launching a strike would mean aircraft returning after dark, possibly running out of fuel, attempting night carrier landings that were dangerous even in peacetime. The aviators called it decision weather. The kind of conditions that separated great commanders from merely good ones. Admiral Mitcher studied the reports. He knew the risks. He also knew the opportunity. At 1620, he gave the order that would define his legacy: launch them. Enterprise's flight deck exploded into controlled chaos. The choreography of carrier operations played out at maximum speed. Aircraft handlers pushed fighters and bombers into position. Ordnance men hung 1,000-pound bombs under dive bomber wings. Torpedo men loaded Mark 13 torpedoes into Avenger bellies. Plane captains spun propellers, checking for smooth rotation. Pilots manned their aircraft, strapping into seats still warm from previous flights. Within minutes, the first Hellcat roared down the deck, catapult throwing it into the sky. Then another, and another. The launch took less than 30 minutes. 216 aircraft from 15 carriers, racing westward toward an enemy that did not know they were coming. Lieutenant Commander Dean led Enterprise's strike group, 12 fighters, 11 dive bombers, 5 torpedo planes. They formed up over the carrier, then turned west, climbing to cruise altitude. The sun was already declining toward the horizon. Simple mathematics told them they would return after dark, if they returned at all. The distance to target, plus the time over target, plus the return flight, plus any combat manoeuvring, meant many aircraft would run out of fuel before reaching the fleet. Some pilots would ditch in the ocean, some would be rescued. Others would simply disappear into darkness and water. This was the calculation each man made in silence. This was the price of pressing the attack. They flew on anyway. At 1840, 216 American aircraft arrived over the Japanese fleet like angels of death. Admiral Ozawa's carriers, having survived the submarine attacks that had sunk Taiho and Shokaku the previous day, were attempting to recover their remaining aircraft. Perhaps 40 fighters circled in combat air patrol, all that remained of the 453 aircraft that had departed Tawi-Tawi. They rose to meet the Americans with courage that bordered on suicide. They were outnumbered 5-1, flying inferior aircraft, flown by pilots whose training had been measured in weeks rather than years. The air combat lasted 15 minutes. 25 Japanese fighters destroyed, the rest scattered or fled. With the sky clear, the bombers attacked. Enterprise's Helldivers pushed over into their dives from 12,000 feet, arrowing toward the carrier Zuikaku at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. The world compressed into a tunnel of focus, the target, the altimeter unwinding, the wind shrieking past the canopy. Release at 2,000 feet. Pull out at 5 Gs, blood draining from the brain, vision greying at the edges, then dive for the wave tops, anti-aircraft tracers chasing like malevolent stars. Behind them, geysers erupted where bombs struck water. Some struck steel. The impacts were massive. 1,000-pound bombs penetrating flight decks, exploding in hangar bays, where fuel and ammunition created secondary detonations that tore ships apart from within. The Avenger torpedo bombers came in at wave-top height, boring through curtains of anti-aircraft fire that turned the air into solid metal. Pilots flew straight and level, mandatory for torpedo drops, while guns from every ship in the Japanese fleet tried to kill them. Some succeeded. Aircraft exploded in flight, debris cartwheeling into the sea. Others pressed on, released their torpedoes at point-blank range, then pulled up and away through fire that seemed thick enough to walk on. The torpedoes churned through water, their wakes arrows straight. Impacts came seconds later, massive underwater explosions that lifted 30,000-ton carriers partially out of the water. The carrier Hio received the concentrated attention of multiple strikes. Bombs penetrated her flight deck. Torpedoes opened her hull to the sea. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as aviation fuel ignited, as magazine spaces cooked off, as the carrier began her death throes. Her crew abandoned ship, leaping into water fouled with oil and debris. At 2,000 she capsized and sank, taking 250 men with her into darkness. The Americans reformed for the return flight, leaving behind a Japanese fleet that was operationally destroyed. Ozawa still had carriers, but they had no aircraft. They had become the most expensive transport vessels in history, worth nothing except as targets. The flight back became a race against darkness and empty fuel tanks. Pilots leaned their mixtures to maximum economy, sacrificing speed for endurance. They climbed to altitude where the air was thin and drag was minimal. They jettisoned everything they could, empty drop tanks, oxygen bottles, even ammunition. Every pound mattered, every gallon of fuel mattered, and still, it would not be enough for many. At 20:45, the first aircraft began ditching. Engines coughed, sputtered, died. Pilots aimed for the dark water below, hoping to land near a destroyer, hoping the crash would be survivable, hoping rescue would find them before hypothermia or sharks. Radio chatter dissolved into desperate calls. "This is Enterprise 47, fuel critical, I'm not going to make it." Blue Base, "This is Skyhawk 12, engine quit, going in." The professional discipline that had characterized the mission gave way to raw fear. Men were dying not from enemy action, but from mathematics. The tyranny of fuel calculations. The unforgiving physics of range versus consumption. Aboard Enterprise, radar operators tracked the returning aircraft, providing vectors toward the fleet. But vectors meant nothing to pilots whose engines were running on fumes. Captain Gardner stood on the bridge, watching the darkness, knowing that out there in the night his men were falling from the sky. Each one represented training, experience, leadership. Each one was irreplaceable. The war would continue, but every pilot lost tonight was a man who would never fly again, never mentor younger pilots, never bring his experience to bear in future battles. At 2:45, Admiral Mitchell made a decision that would be remembered whenever carrier warfare was discussed. He ordered every ship in Task Force 58 to turn on their lights. Searchlights stabbed upward into darkness. Masthead lights illuminated. Deck lights blazed. Star shells burst overhead, turning night into artificial day. The fleet became a city of light in the middle of an empty ocean, a beacon visible for 100 miles. It was a violation of every doctrine about light discipline and submarine threats. It was also an act of humanity that would save dozens of lives. The returning aircraft, lost in darkness, suddenly had a destination, a target that could not be missed. They came home to an ocean of light. The landing operations that followed tested every pilot's skill to its absolute limit. Night carrier landings were difficult under ideal conditions, requiring precision that approached the limits of human capability. Now, pilots exhausted from combat, flying aircraft damaged by anti-aircraft fire, low on fuel, had to find their carrier in a sea of illuminated ships, execute an approach in darkness, and land on a pitching deck, with only minimal lighting to mark the landing area. Some succeeded through skill, others through luck. Many through both. Enterprise's landing signal officer stood at his station on the port side of the flight deck, holding illuminated paddles that glowed like fireflies in the darkness. He watched each approaching aircraft, judging its altitude, its angle of attack, its airspeed. High, low, fast, slow, cut. The paddle signals were cryptic, meaningful only to those who understood the language of naval aviation. Some pilots executed perfect approaches, touching down exactly on center line, snagging the third wire. Others came in too fast, missed all the wires, bolted back into the air for another attempt. A few crashed. The sickening crunch of metal against steel, fire suppression crews running with hoses and extinguishers, coursemen pulling injured pilots from wreckage. The flight deck became a scene of controlled chaos, tragedy and triumph playing out simultaneously. By midnight, the recovery was complete. Enterprise had recovered her own aircraft plus refugees from other carriers whose decks were full. The flight deck was packed wingtip to wingtip with aircraft, some damaged, all exhausted. In the ready rooms, pilots collapsed into chairs, too tired to speak. Some wept. Others simply stared at nothing. The mission had been a success by any measure. They had sunk a Japanese carrier, damaged others, destroyed dozens of aircraft. But the cost had been high. 80 aircraft lost from the entire task force, most to fuel exhaustion. 49 pilots and aircrew killed or missing. The mathematics of victory always included subtraction. In the Combat Information Center, intelligence officers compiled the final tallies from both days of combat. June 19th, 3 to 15, Japanese carrier aircraft destroyed, 50 land-based aircraft destroyed. June 20th, 65, additional aircraft destroyed. Total Japanese losses, approximately 430 aircraft. 3 carriers sunk, Taiho, Shokaku, Hio. American losses, 130 aircraft, 76 aircrew. The numbers told a story of one-sided destruction. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air arm had been annihilated. The pilots lost could not be replaced. The training programs had collapsed under fuel shortages. Future Japanese naval aviation would consist of undertrained pilots flying obsolete aircraft against an enemy that dominated through every measure of combat power. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the point where industrial warfare achieved its final form. What had begun at Midway, continued through the Solomons, refined at Tarawa and Kwajalein, reached perfection in these waters. The Americans had transformed warfare into a systematic process where technological superiority, logistical depth, and training quality combined to produce results that approached mathematical certainty. The Japanese had fought with courage. They had pressed attacks despite overwhelming odds. They had died with honour. But courage and honour were insufficient against an enemy that fought with industrial logic. Enterprise had been part of this transformation. Her aircraft contributed to the destruction of over 400 enemy planes in 2 days, though exact attribution was impossible in the chaos of combat. Her search planes found the Japanese fleet on June 20th, enabling the strike that sank Hio. Her Combat Information Center directed fighter operations during the Turkey shoot. Her crew operated at peak efficiency through 48 hours of continuous combat. She was one carrier among 15, but her contribution was significant, her legacy secure. The Big E had been there at Pearl Harbor when the war began. She had been at Midway when the tide turned, and she had been at the Philippine Sea when Japanese naval aviation died. The strategic consequences rippled outward like waves from a dropped stone. With Japanese carrier aviation destroyed, American forces could operate with near impunity across the Central Pacific. Saipan fell on July 9th, providing bases for B-29s that would burn Japanese cities. Tinian fell on August 1st. Guam was recaptured on August 10th. Each conquest brought American bombers closer to the home islands, tightening the noose around a nation that had gambled everything on a war it could not win. The Japanese had believed in the superiority of spirit over material. They had believed that courage could compensate for industrial weakness. They had believed that a warrior culture could triumph over a nation of factory workers and farmers. The Philippine Sea proved every belief was false. In the decades that followed, historians would analyse the battle as a case study in how modern warfare had evolved beyond individual heroism into industrial process. The coordination between radar, fighter direction, and airborne aircraft created a defensive system of unprecedented effectiveness. The strike operations demonstrated that American carriers could project power at ranges that rendered enemy retaliation impossible. The training programs produced pilots who were not just skilled, but systematically trained to standards that the enemy could no longer match. Every advantage compounded into overwhelming superiority. For the men who fought there, the battle would be remembered differently. They would remember the ease of the killing, the mechanical nature of it, the way aircraft fell from the sky like rain. They would remember the night landings, the terror of running out of fuel in darkness, the lights of the fleet appearing like salvation. They would remember comrades who ditched in the ocean and were never found, whose names were read at memorial services, whose belongings were packed and sent home to families who would never fully understand what had happened in those waters. War had become efficient. That efficiency came with a cost measured in human terms that statistics could never capture. The Japanese survivors would carry different memories. They would remember the day their air groups were destroyed, when pilots who had trained together, eaten together, dreamed together, died together in a few hours of mechanized slaughter. They would remember the sound of American machine guns, that distinctive chattering roar that meant death. They would remember watching their carriers sink, the ships that had been their homes, their worlds, disappearing beneath dark water. Some would survive the war, would return to a devastated Japan, would rebuild lives in the ashes of empire. They would tell their children that they had fought against an enemy that did not just defeat them, but had demonstrated that the entire basis of their military culture was obsolete. USS Enterprise would continue fighting until war's end, participating in strikes against the Philippines, Okinawa, and the Japanese home islands. She would survive kamikaze attacks, weather, mechanical failures, and the accumulated wear of nearly 4 years of continuous combat. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Enterprise was one of the most decorated ships in American naval history, having earned 20 battle stars. She had been there for every major carrier battle except Coral Sea. She had survived when others sank. She had fought when others were under repair. Her name had become legend. They scrapped her in 1958, broke her down for parts, melted her steel, scattered her components across a nation that had already forgotten most of what she represented. There were campaigns to save her, to turn her into a museum, to preserve what she symbolised. All failed. The Big E was cut apart in a New Jersey scrapyard, reduced from symbol to raw material. But what she represented could not be scrapped. The lessons of the Philippine Sea, the demonstration of how industrial power could achieve military dominance, those lessons endured. They shaped naval doctrine, influenced strategic thinking, reminded future generations that wars are won not just by courage, but by the systematic application of overwhelming force. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended Japanese carrier aviation as an effective force. In 2 days, 430 aircraft destroyed, 3 carriers sunk, an entire generation of naval pilots killed or scattered. The mathematics were undeniable. The industrial logic was absolute. The Americans had not just won a battle. They had demonstrated that modern warfare belonged to those who could produce, train, and deploy military force as a systematic industrial process. The Japanese had laughed at American aircraft in 1941, calling them inferior to Zero fighters. By June 1944, they were no longer laughing. The sky belonged to America. The war was over, though it would take another year and 2 atomic bombs before Japan would accept what the Philippine Sea had already proven. They had challenged an industrial colossus, and they had been obliterated by mathematics made manifest in steel, fire, and systematic destruction.